you're going to run into situations where you have different records that will need to be linked together for some reason to facilitate things like more detailed reporting or allowing it to be attached to another record inside the application. So for example, like when you have an opportunity or an order that you've created inside Dynamics 365, oftentimes you'll want to attach the opportunity to a specific account. In order to do this, you actually have to have a relationship between those two records in order for it to understand that this opportunity would be specifically associated with that account in the application. And so in this module, what we want to do is we want to look at how the relationship process works inside Dynamics 365. So we're going to do just a quick little overview on what relationships are and how they're defined inside the application. We're going to talk a little bit about the different types of relationships that are available inside Dynamics 365, and this includes the one-to-many relationships as well as the many-to-many relationships. We're also going to talk a little bit about hierarchical relationships and what those mean inside the application and what are some of the different options you have for controlling how you work with parent and child records. We're going to look at the concept of entity mapping, which would allow you to pre-populate data from one record to another record. And then we're going to discuss connection and connection rules. And those are really used in situations where you can't relate the two records together in the traditional sense, so you need to have more of a different way of looking at those. So for example, you might have a contact who used to work for an account, but they don't anymore. But you still want to recognize that that person was somehow affiliated with that account in the past. You could do that through a connection and a connection rule, basically defining them as a former employee, which now allows you to report on some of that and still see that information inside the application without having to define another relationship between those two entities in the app. Dynamics 365 supports two types of relationships. There's this concept of a one-to-many relationship and a many-to-many relationship. Now, one-to-many relationships are the ones that you're going to see probably most often within the application, and they do exactly what they sound. You have one record that would basically be the primary entity in the relationship that might have many different related records associated with it across the board. So for example, I have an account and a contact relationship. Account would be the primary entity in that relationship. Contact would be the related entity. One account might have no contacts, one contact, or several different contacts related to it inside the application. Now, when you think of a one-to-many relationship, really it's just that lookup field concept. So if you remember when we were talking about in previous modules, we talked about the concept of a lookup field. When you create a lookup field, like for example on the loan application entity that looks up information from an account, I am creating a relationship automatically in the system, and all it's doing is storing the GUID of that record inside that relationship. Now, inside CRM, you will also see when you look at the entities, and we'll show you this in the demo as well, you'll see this concept of a many-to-one or a one-to-many relationship. It's the same thing, it's just what record are you looking at when you're working through it. So if you're going in and you're looking at relationships and you see a one-to-many relationship, that is basically allowing you to look at it from the context of the parent record. So the parent record in this relationship is here, the related record is here. If you look at a many-to-one, you're looking at it in the context of the related record. So this is the child record in that relationship, and we'll show you that here as we're going through. The other concept that you have would be a many-to-many relationship, where you have many different records from one entity that might be related to many different records in another. For example, there is a natural many-to-many relationship in Dynamics 365 between competitors and opportunities. You might have one competitor that is competing on multiple opportunities, but at the same point in time, you might have one opportunity that has multiple competitors that are bidding against that opportunity against you. And so that's the concept of a many-to-many relationship. And typically what it does is it uses what's called an intersect entity that normally is hidden inside the application that basically has a one-to-many relationship with the two items that are ultimately going to be joined. So if you looked at it from a competitor and opportunity standpoint, there would be an intersect entity that has a one-to-many relationship with competitors and a one-to-many relationship with opportunities that, based upon that situation, ultimately creates the many-to-many relationship between competitors and opportunities inside the application. Let's examine this one-to-many relationship with just a little bit more detail. So when you're in the application itself and you're looking at it, depending upon what entity you're looking at it through, it might either be a one-to-many or a many-to-one relationship, and that's based upon what entity you're working with. But the concept is they're exactly the same. So if you look at kind of from this perspective, I have a scenario where I have a venue and I have events that might be booked at that particular venue. There is a one-to-many relationship between venue and events. I'm going to have one venue that might have multiple events hosted with it. If I'm on the venue end of it and I'm looking at the relationship, I'm looking at it from a one-to-many perspective because I'm looking at venue being the primary entity and events being the child entity. If I'm on the events end of it and I look at the relationship, I would really be looking at it at the many-to-one scenario. It's still a one-to-many relationship with venue being the primary and events being the secondary. It just really provides me more of a shortcut to be able to kind of pull in and look at events from the related record perspective. So the nice thing about this is when you're creating this, you're really just adding a lookup field to events or on the event entity that looks up the venue. So if I had gone on to events and added a lookup field to venue, I would in essence be creating the relationship just like I normally would. This is what you would see from a relationship perspective. So based upon the entity that you're on when you initiate the relationship, the primary entity will ultimately be filled in. So if I'm on the account record and I create a new relationship where it's going to be a one-to-many relationship, account will automatically fill in as the primary entity. If I am on the account entity and I create a new many-to-one relationship, it'll open up the same screen. The only difference is primary entity will not have anything entered into it and related entity will have account associated with it. So it really just depends upon what entity you're on when you invoke the relationship itself. The next thing it's going to ask you for is a name of that relationship. And that name is really going to be what's referenced inside the application. So you would just define some type of database schema name that you want to use inside that scenario. And then the next part of that is, since this is going to be a lookup field on the application, you will then have to define what you want the lookup field to be called. So in this case, if I was looking at it from a contact perspective, I might want the lookup field to be called parent account. Or if I was looking at this from a bookings perspective or an events perspective within venues, on the event entity, I might want to have the lookup field called venue. So that way I can click on the magnifying glass and select the venue that I want to work with. But these are the individual options that you can determine for how you want this information to basically be communicated back to the users. And then you can also define how you want those items to be displayed inside the navigation area. So when I'm looking at venue and I see all the events that are associated with it, do I just want to use the plural name of events inside the application, or would I want to create some type of custom label that would allow me to define that? This is where I can go in and really just kind of build the relationship from an application standpoint. Another consideration that you have to think about when you're creating these relationships are what are called cascading rules. And what cascading rules do is they define what actions will be push down to the related records based upon what you do to the primary record. Now, for the most part, when you create a lookup field or a relationship between two items inside Dynamics 365, there is really no concept of cascading rules. When you do something to the primary record, it's not necessarily going to affect the related records because there's really just a lookup field that ties them together. But there might be situations where you want specific things to take place that would push down into those scenarios. So for example, if I delete an account, what's going to happen to those contacts? Do I want those contacts to also be deleted in the system? Do I just want the lookup field to be cleared out so those contacts no longer have a reference to the account record? How do I want that to be handled within the application? And so what's nice about these cascading options is you can set these kind of as needed to define how that's going to work to kind of help better prevent orphan records, but also give people the ability to do different things throughout the concept of the application. Now, by default, whenever you create a lookup field or any type of relationship inside the system, the behavior is going to be set to referential, which basically means that if you were to go ahead and do something to the parent record, all that's going to happen is it's going to remove the link basically between the individual items. It's not going to push anything out or reflect any of those different situations. If you want something more to take place, this is where you can do that through the assign rules, which you'll kind of see down on the bottom. So there's a few different actions that can trigger cascading behavior inside the application. The first one would be like the assign action. So I have gone in and I have an account that is assigned to me that has multiple opportunities associated with it. I am now going to take that account and I am going to assign it to somebody else within the application. Do I want those opportunities that are associated with that account to also be assigned to somebody else in the application, or do I not really care? So this gives me the capabilities to decide what that would take place. Same thing with sharing. So I share out an account. Do I want the related records to also be shared? Or if I have something that's been shared, what do I want to take place? So really the actions that you would see would be reparenting, merging, deleting, or sharing. And these allow you to define what's going to happen inside the application when one of those functionalities or items take place. Now, they've given you a few different options available to you. The first option that you see is Cascade All. So what Cascade All is going to do is it's going to perform that action on all the related entity records. So for example, if I have an account that is associated with my login and I have multiple opportunities that are associated with that account, when somebody assigns that account to somebody else, all of those opportunities are also going to be assigned to that new user if I have Cascade All selected within the application. Now you got to be careful with that one, because now you may have a bunch of opportunities that were originally associated with people other than me that now might be assigned to somebody else that they shouldn't have been. So a better option might be, looking at either user owned or Cascade Active. Cascade Active is going to perform that action on all related entity records as long as they are set to active or open. So in this case, it would only assign opportunities to the new person if those opportunities were set to open. Or if I use Cascade User Own, now it's only going to assign the open opportunities in the system that were owned by me to the new user. All the other opportunities that might be owned by other people within the application will still remain the same. And so you really need to look at this from a cascading perspective to decide, okay, what's going to happen when you're working with it. Same thing with Cascade None. If it's set to Cascade None, it's not going to do anything. And these are really on your assign, share, and reparent permissions. If you have anything set to anything but none, it will change the relationship scope from what's called a referential relationship to a parental relationship. Now, deleting is a little bit different. When you start deleting scenarios, you have to define what's going to happen from that perspective. So obviously, Cascade All, if I delete an account and that account has open opportunity or has opportunities associated with it, if I have it set to Cascade All, that's going to delete all the opportunities attached to that account as well. If I choose Remove Link, which is the default, all that's going to do is it's going to clear out the lookup field. Those items or those opportunities are still going to exist inside Dynamics 365. They're just going to be orphaned. They're not necessarily going to have a specific account associated with them. And then the other one would be Restrict Delete. And now this one basically says, hey, I'm not going to let you do this. I'm not going to let you delete this account record because there's open opportunities associated with this. And so this is obviously the most restrictive. You just have to look at it in the right context to determine whether or not it's going to be ultimately what you want to work with. Now, inside the system, they have created some predefined behavior that you can set inside that relationship to just set some of these different things for you automatically without having to go through and manually assign them. So the first one would be parental. So if you set it to a parental relationship, that's by default going to set all rules to Cascade All. If you have it set as referential, that'll basically set pretty much all the rules with the exception of the delete to Cascade None, and then all it's going to do is it's going to remove the link within those items. This is the default behavior that you'll see anytime you create just kind of a generic relationship in the application. Then you get into referential restrict delete, which basically sets everything to cascade none, but doesn't let you delete the record. So it puts a restrict delete on the actual delete option. And then you've got your configurable cascading, where you can actually go in and kind of define whatever specific options you want based upon your own specific preference. Again, the two you're probably going to use most often that we tend to see is referential and then the restrict delete, because you want to prevent orphan links. The other ones really just depend upon the specific use cases that you would be looking at and the underlying circumstances around those options. One final consideration that you want to keep in mind with relationships is they can be deleted if necessary. So maybe you run into a situation where you had a lookup field between that, those individual entities within the application, and now you've just decided that you don't necessarily need that relationship anymore. You can remove them. Now, a couple of things that you have to remember is if you have already added the lookup field to a form. So if I've gone in and I've created, the lookup field on events that are looking up to venues, and I've published that event form, so now that lookup field is on the form and people are working with it, I cannot remove that relationship. And the reason why I can't remove that relationship is because I have a dependency on that relationship on that form. So one of the things that you could do, if you remember back to the solutions module, is we could go into that show dependencies area, and I could actually do show dependencies to see what entities are currently using that relationship. Then I could go into that event form, I could look at the lookup field, remove the lookup field from that event form. Once I remove that and then publish the form again without that field, now I've in essence removed that dependency, which would then allow me to go out and physically delete or remove the relationship from the application. But the system does prevent you from doing that if you have that associated or published on any forms within the application. Once you remove the dependency, then you can remove the relationships without any real issues. So let's look at this inside the application. So again, I have my loan application entity and I have my account entity. And if I click on my loan application entity, one of the things that I can see in here are my one-to-many and many-to-one relationships. And so if I look at this from a one-to-many perspective, this is going to show me all the relationships in the system where loan application is the primary entity in the relationship, and then we have related items. Now you'll notice there's a lot of these around like connections and activities. This has a lot to do with when we created the entity and we defined that we could associate activities with it. It created a lot of relationships to things like the appointment entity, the email entity, all of those individual items where loan application is the primary item or the primary entity in the relationship. If I come in here and I look at many-to-one, now I'm looking at it from a completely opposite perspective. Now I'm looking at a scenario where loan application is the related entity within this situation. And so this is where now I can see that, account and account is the primary entity in the relationship and applicant or loan application is the related entity. If I were to go ahead and create a new many-to-one relationship here, this is where I could now go ahead and hit new many-to-one, and this would now create a new relationship with loan application as the related entity inside this particular environment. So I can see that loan entity is automatically defined as the related item, and then the primary entity I can select based upon what specific item I want to work with. Now I'm just going to close out of here real quick, and I'm just going to open up this account applicant entity. So in this situation, what I can see is I have account being the primary entity in the relationship, loan application being the related. It is a searchable field. I can also see that the display name is applicant, so this is going to be the field that is going to be displayed on the loan application area. I can then go down and see the what it's going to use for the primary navigation. So in this case, it's using the plural name. And then this is that relationship behavior that we talked about. So right now it's using referential. But if I wanted to, I could switch this to parental, and then it will set all of these individual situations based upon those items. Or I could switch this to referential restrict delete, and I can see that it modifies each one of these items. Or I could go to configurable cascading, and I could set each one to whatever specific item I want to work with. But this is where if you want to start defining specifics around what these relationships are going to do, this is where we can go in and do this. Once we've made the modifications to either the behavior behavioral or how the items are going to be displayed within the application, then I can just go ahead and hit save and close. That's going to save and close the relationship, and then I can work with information from there. Another option that you have are this concept of many-to-many relationships. And so when you start talking about many-to-many relationships, there's a couple of different ways that that can be achieved. There's the native many-to-many relationships, which is kind of out-of-the-box functionality from a Dynamics 365 perspective. And then there's this concept of what are called manual many-to-many relationships. Realistically, the concept behind what they're doing is exactly the same. There's just a little bit different presentation method that's behind them. So out of the box, you will see what's called kind of a native many-to-many relationships. So in this case, maybe I have this concept of events that we're working with, and those events might have contacts that are coming to those. So just like any situation, one contact might attend multiple events, and one event might have multiple contacts associated with it. From a native perspective inside CRM, it uses what's called a hidden intersect entity. So this is actually an entity behind the scenes. You don't have access to customize or do anything with this. It just basically sits there with a one-to-many relationship between itself and events and between itself and contacts. This basically, the facilitation of this intersect entity is what is going to facilitate the creation of that many-to-many relationship between events and contacts. Because this is native functionality, you don't have a lot of customization options around this situation. Now, with that being said, sometimes you run into situations where you want to have a little bit more customization. And so one of the things you can do is you can create what's called a manual many-to-many relationship. And what that does is that replaces this hidden intersect entity with an entity that you create. So now in this case, I might create an entity called bookings, and then I will create a one-to-many relationship between bookings and contacts, and I will create a one-to-many relationship between bookings and events, which ultimately is going to give me that same type of many-to-many behavior. Now the reason why you would do this is because since I create this custom entity called bookings, now I have customization capabilities. I can add fields, I can add things like date, status, cost, all of these different things, and now I ultimately can report off of that. And so instead of using the native functionality where yes, the relationship exists, I don't necessarily have all of the reporting functionality. So by going in and creating my own manual functionality, now I have capabilities to customize that intersect entity whichever way I deem necessary, and now I can also, report off of that or use that. So you need to kind of look at from an application perspective, if there is a need for a many-to-many relationship, what is it, and then what are the specific things that you want to define inside that procedure. Another option that you have when it comes to relationships is this concept of hierarchical data. And before we get kind of into the structure and how they're defined, think of it from kind of a typical parent account scenario. So if you look at the visual that you see here on the side, we have this company called Contoso Corporation. Now, Contoso Corporation might have many different subsidiary businesses that are associated with it. They might have Contoso Heavy Machines, Contoso Logistics, and other individual items that they would be working with. Normally, you would set, for Contoso Heavy Machines, you would set Contoso Corporation as the parent customer. Same thing with Contoso Logistics. Contoso Logistics will have Contoso Corporation set as the parent customer, but then the airways and the railways customers might have Contoso Logistics set up as the parent customer. And so what's nice about defining this hierarchical structure is now I have the ability to really start to drill into this organization and see what different subsidiaries and companies make up this individual scenario. Now, historically speaking, from a application standpoint, we really only had hierarchical data that was available from the account record. Now, as the application has matured, you can set up and define this hierarchical structure really for any entity within the application. So from a loan application perspective, maybe I was doing a commercial lending project where I was actually going to lend this out in different phases. Maybe we had the first phase, which is maybe for one location. Maybe we had a second phase, which is for another location. I could create, in essence, this hierarchy to set this information. Now, what happens when you define a hierarchical relationship is you're really just creating what's called a self-referential relationship between that record. So when I look at, like, for example, the account record, I have a relationship where account is both the primary and the related entity in that relationship. And then I can define that as a hierarchical relationship. So if I look at this for an account perspective, I can see that I have an account hierarchy that uses the parent-account relationship where I have one account associated with another account, and then I can define kind of the hierarchy settings within the application itself to display it in this nice tree view that you see right here on the application itself. Now, a couple of things to remember when you start talking about hierarchical relationships. The way you create hierarchies in the application is by creating what's called a self-referential relationship. There are several different entities, like the account entity, that already have those relationships defined, which you do not have the ability to go in and customize. However, you can go in and create your own referential relationships between those individual items and set it as a hierarchical relationship. Now, when you create a hierarchy, you have the ability to only have one hierarchy per entity. So when I go in and create a self-referential relationship between entities, I can only set one of those as the hierarchical relationship within the application. And this now gives me the capabilities to view that information as I'm moving forward. When I start looking at the hierarchy, I can look at the hierarchy within the context of that entity. So what that bottom bullet point says is hierarchy or visualizations is limited to only one entity. Basically what that means is if I wanted to see the account and all the contacts associated with that account in a visualization, I could not do that using the hierarchy visualization. I would have to do that through some other mechanism to be able to facilitate that. And I'll show you that here in just a couple of seconds as we move through. So let's hop back in the application and visually look at how this is all set up. So you can see here I have my active accounts inside Dynamics 365. And you can see that for ADatum Corporation and AdventureWorks Cycles, I have kind of this little tree view here, which basically is defining that this has a hierarchy associated with it. Now, before I drill into that, let's just show you kind of what this looks like from an application standpoint. So if I go into like this Blue Yonder Airlines, I can set their parent account to be, for example, AdventureWorks. And when I save this and then go back into accounts, I can see that it now has this little tree view associated with it. When I click on this tree view, now I can see the hierarchy for this account structure inside the application. So I can see that at a top level, ADatum is the underlying parent overall. AdventureWorks is the actual subsidiary company, and then Blue Yonder is the bottom part of this relationship. And this is where now I can visually kind of see what this information looks like. So this is what the concept of the hierarchy relationship or the hierarchical relationship inside the application looks like. And so this is what you're defining when you create this relationship structure inside the application. So now if I were to go back into, for example, settings and solutions, and I were to open up my loan management solution and expand entities, let's look at this account entity. So I'm going to go into the one-to-many relationships for accounts. And I can see that in here I have all of these different items that are associated with it. And if I look down, I have this account-to-account parental relationship. And this is defined on the parent account. So if I open up this relationship here, I can see that this is where I have one account that might be related to another account where they're defined as the parental account for that particular item. If I look at hierarchical, I can see that this is set to a hierarchical relationship, which basically means that this is the relationship that's being used to define the hierarchy inside the application. So if this was from a custom entity perspective and I wanted to set up the same type of functionality, for example, on like the loan application, this is where I could go in and define that. But in this situation, it's already defined as a hierarchical relationship, and it's grayed out because I can only have one hierarchical relationship per entity within this item. So if I save and close this now, I will see under the account entity that I have a hierarchy settings. And if I click on this hierarchy settings, this is what's going to show me the actual configuration that was available behind the scenes. And so this is the account hierarchy. If I open up the account hierarchy, I can see that this is using the parent account relationship as the item, but then it's also using a quick view form to define how that information is displayed on the application. So right now it's using what's called the account hierarchy tile form to facilitate that. If I wanted to, I could create a new view that would basically allow me to display this information in the application. Now, when we talk about forms and views here in just a little bit, we'll show you exactly what that looks like. But this is where I can define how this information is going to be displayed inside that hierarchy, which is basically going to constitute into those little tiles that were displayed on the tree. This is a wonderful scenario, particularly in high-end scenarios where you have a lot of sub-items that you want to work through, cases, opportunities, any of those types of things, where you can define this hierarchy relationship and use that information as you're moving forward to really just give yourself kind of a nice visual presentation for this information on a much larger scale. Another advantage of having relationships between entities is this concept of what's called entity mapping. And so when you think about, like, for example, I have an account and that account has multiple contacts associated with it. If I was going to create a new contact directly from that account record, it would make sense that I would maybe potentially want to have things like the phone number and the address and specific information about that account be pre-populated whenever I create a new contact directly from that account record. And that's really what entity mapping allows you to do, is it allows you to basically pre-populate data entry information when you're creating a new record that is related to the parent. So for example, if I'm on the account record and I create a new contact, it will pre-populate specific fields on the contact record from the account record that I'm working with. Now, the nice thing about data mapping, as opposed to like the calculated fields that we talked about, from a calculated fields perspective, when you're feeding in information from the parent to the related record, you can't change that. You can't overwrite that. So that's always going to be there. From a mapping perspective, users can overwrite that. All it's trying to do is pre-populate data to make the information easier for you to enter in. But if you need to change or overwrite that information, you can change or overwrite that information as much as you want to. And the other thing that's kind of nice about this is you can map information when you are doing these entity mappings from a ton of, from multiple different source attributes to the target entity. So for example, if I have a situation where, I have an account, well, that account has a address associated with it. When I'm creating an order, I might want to go in and map the account address to both the billing and the shipping address on that order, because ultimately 9 times out of 10 they're going to be the same address. Now, there might be different circumstances where they're different, and in that situation with entity mapping, I just go into the one that needs to be changed, make the change, and I don't have any issues. So it just is really there for data population and ease of data entry inside the application. Now, there's a couple of things that you have to remember when you start talking about attribute mapping. The first thing is it only works when a new record is created in the context of the parent. So for example, if I go in and I create a new contact directly from the account record, entity mapping is going to take over and everything's going to work. If I go in and I create a new contact and then choose the account while I'm creating the new contact, mapping doesn't facilitate that. I have to be on the parent record, facilitate creation of the record from the parent, and then that will transfer over into the subsequent records from there. The other thing is mapping does not apply, like I said, if they create it manually outside of the context. The other thing is it does not do any updation of that record. It's only for pre-population when you're creating a new record. So if I create a record using entity mapping and I go into the parent and I make a change, that is not going to subsequently go down and change all the related records associated with it. So it doesn't maintain any relationships or keep anything synchronized. It's really only used for pre-population of data. So sometimes what you also have to look at from an attribute perspective is this ultimately, the best scenario to use for pre-population? Would calculated fields be a little bit better option? What are some of the different baseline situations that I want to work with? The other thing that you have to remember when you start talking about entity mapping is there are some restrictions in regards to what types of attributes can actually be mapped. So for example, both attributes have to be the same data type. So if I'm going to map like address information, they both have to be simple line of text. I couldn't map a date field to a simple line of text field, or map a date field to a numeric field. So they have to be exactly the same data type. The other thing is the target attribute that you're trying to map it to has to be at least equal to or greater than the length of the source attribute. So for example, if I have an address field on the account record that has a length of 250 characters, and I have an address field on the contact record that has a length of 150 characters, I can't do that mapping because the target field is less from a length perspective than the source. If it's flipped around, if it's 100 on the account and it's 200 on the contact, absolutely. So you just have to kind of keep that in mind. And the other thing is I cannot actually map to more than one target field. So once I've mapped something to that target field, so once I've mapped the address to the address field on the contact record, I can't map any other fields to that particular field. I could have another address field on the target that I would work with, but I can't necessarily map more than one items to the same target. And if I have something that is disabled, or if I have a field that I've disabled in the application, I can't map that from a disabled field as well. So let's look at this data mapping functionality. So I'm inside my application and I'm inside my relationships with the loan application. Now in this case, I want to look at the relationship between the account entity and the loan application. So that way if somebody creates a loan application for an account, I want to be able to facilitate data mapping. So I'm going to go into my many-to-one relationships. I'm going to find the relationship between the account and the item that I'm working with. So I'm going to open up the account and applicant relationships. Now, if I come into here, on the relationship itself, I will see a mappings option. And so when I click on mappings, this is going to show me all the fields that will be pre-populated if I create a loan application directly from the account. So I can see that it's pulling in the account ID from those items. If I click on New to facilitate my new item, I can go ahead and click on New, and it's going to create a new mapping. And so what it's going to show me over here is all the fields coming from the account entity and then the subsequent target fields on the loan application. So for example, if I wanted to look at address 1, line 1, this would be my street address. I can look at address 1, line 1. I can scroll over. I can see that it's a single line of text with 250 characters. If I scroll over down here, I can see that I have loan address, which is address 1, which is a single line of text that is basically 500 characters. So in this case, I can see since the data types match, I can go ahead and map these. So I can go ahead and click on OK, and this will create a map between the two fields. If for some reason the data types didn't match or the field links didn't match, if I try to create an invalid mapping, the system will tell me that. The system will say you can't do this because of an invalid situation. It won't necessarily tell you that it's a data type issue or that it's a field length issue. It'll just tell you that you're unable to map that based upon those situations. Now the other thing is once I go in and I click on New again, now I could go to the second part of this scenario where I could map these items together. So now I could come in here, I have address 1 city. I'm going to map that to the city field on my loan. Now you'll notice that address 1 has disappeared. That's that thing we talked about not being able to map to the same target field more than once. Once that map has been facilitated, I cannot map another field to that option unless I remove that mapping. I could map address 1, line 1 to multiple fields on that target entity, but once I have a mapping in place for that field, I can't override that. Now the other thing that you'll notice in here is with entity mapping, you are somewhat limited in the fact that you do have to set up each individual map one by one. There isn't a scenario where I can check all the different fields that I want here and then check all the different fields that I want here and have it create those mappings. It is very much a process where you do have to go in for each item that you want to work with, click on New, walk through the item, pick each individual field that you want to map within those situations. So in this case, I'd have to come in here now and find my postal code, map that to my zip code field, and then do the same thing for state. And I'll ask me 1 sec, we'll finish that mapping process here. Now, there is an option, if you come up here underneath More Actions, there is an option to generate mappings. And so what this does is this will go out and try to pick, based upon what you already have in place, the fields that it feels like it should map across. Now, not a huge fan of generate mappings, because if we're being very honest, it doesn't necessarily ever map the ones that I'm expecting it to map. It maps a lot more around the system ones. If you are going to do generate mappings, I usually tell people do that ahead of time, because once you do that, if you already have mappings in place and you choose generate mappings, it'll overwrite what you have. So it's very easy to go ahead, generate the mappings after the fact, or ahead of time, determine which ones you want to use, and then just add the ones that you want to work through. But for each field that you want to facilitate as part of this, you'll have to go in, define what the items are that you want to work with, and then generate the map from there. And then once you're done, you can just go ahead and hit save and close. And then once you publish and push all this information out, when you create a new record from the parent, from the context of the parent, it'll automatically fill all those fields in. Now, like I said, in the next module, we'll get into form customization, and we'll show you kind of how all this information is going to tie together. But for now, that kind of shows you the concept behind how you create at least the entity mappings if you want to facilitate that. The final consideration that you want to think about from a relationship perspective is the fact that sometimes you're going to have fields or items that need to be related together, but you can't necessarily create a lookup field, or you don't necessarily want to create a traditional CR or traditional relationship between the two entities. And so one of the ways that you can do this is through what are called connections and connection roles. And what's cool about connection and connection roles is you don't have to create that custom relationship. You use what are called the connection entity and the connection role entity to actually link those items together. So it's kind of almost like a many-to-many relationship between those items using an intersect entity. What's nice about these connections is you now can connect different records together based upon different entities. So I could have a connection between a custom entity and a system entity. Once I go in and create those connections between those items, now those connections can actually be used from a reporting perspective. And so what's nice is there's kind of a two-tier process to this. The first thing that you have to do is on the entity itself, if you remember when we went into the entity definition, there was an option for connections. Once you enable the entity for connections, now you can use connections inside the application. You then also have the capabilities to go in and create what are called connection roles. And these connection roles allow you to go out and provide descriptions for how these two records are going to be connected. So for example, you might have, a connection role for former employee and employer. So now when you go in and select that connection, if you pick somebody as a former employee, it's going to realize that the record you're relating it to is probably the employer. And so this is where, if you have very specific use cases inside the application, this is where you can set up and kind of configure those based upon your specific needs. So when I go back into my loan management solution and I click on the loan application entity, one of the areas that I'll see down here is communication and collaboration. And as I go down into these particular situations, I can see that connections is enabled, which basically means that I want to go ahead and be able to use this as part of connections. So the next thing that I can do is I can configure what these different connection roles look like inside the application. So now I can go into here, for example, into connection roles. And first and foremost, I can hit Add Existing, and these show me all the different connection roles that already exist inside the application. So these are kind of the ones that are out of the box or based upon solutions. So I've got, are they a child? Are they a colleague? Are they the decision maker, employee, employer? These are different types of connection roles that I might see inside the application. Now let's just go ahead and choose employee and employer here for a second, and then go ahead and click on OK. So now if I open up employee, I can see that this is where I can define what these items will work with. So there's an option here for connection role category that basically says, is it a business item? Is it a family, social? This is more just for reporting scenarios where you can kind of define how you want these options to be facilitated. Then the other option that you see over here where it says record types is these are the actual items that I can use to associate with this connection role. So this connection role of employee and employer is only available for contacts, for leads, and for users. If I look down at the bottom, I can see what's called a matching connection role. And so if I look at this matching connection role and I open it up for employer, I can see that obviously employer is probably an account. And so this now shows me that if I were to create a connection between two records in the application, the employee will be a contact, the employer would be an account. And so this is where if you wanted to create something for like doctor patients, clients, attorney client, something like that, this is where you could create these connection roles that would now be able to be facilitated inside the application. Now we already have these employee-employer ones created, so I could consume them inside CRM. So let me just kind of show you an example of that. So now if I go back into Dynamics 365 and I go into a sales and a contact, I'm going to open up Jim Glynn here. And if I go up into my related area up here on the top, I will see an option for connections. So I want to connect Jim Glynn to somebody. So I'm going to hit connections and it's going to say, what active connection do I want to work with? So I want to connect Jim to either a different record or myself. In this case, I am going to connect him to another record. I am going to connect him to an account. So I'm going to connect him to a datum, and I am going to connect him to a datum where a datum is the employer. Or in this case, actually, let's make him, we'll go there. We'll hit save and close. And now if I open this up, I can see that a datum is Jim's employer, and underneath the details, I can see that Jim was the employee. So this is just a great way that now I could surface this in reports and I could use this information to now have better capabilities and a better look into what's happening. But this is definitely something that you can go in, customize to fit your specific needs based upon what your terminology is, remove any of the connection rules you don't want to use, and then just kind of set it up and define it for what specifically you want to use in the app. When you're going through and designing a Dynamics 365 implementation, you really want to take into consideration how the users are going to work with the data and what specific reporting that you might require based upon those situations. And that way you can actually go out and define how you're going to create or what is the right relationship to create between those specific records to make sure that they have the ability to do whatever they need to do. One-to-many relationships really allow you to define the different behavior options, cascading options, and different actions that you want to do based upon what the parent is working, but make sure you understand what entity should be the parent in that relationship and what entity should be the child. So that way you can make sure that when you are creating that relationship, you're initiating it accordingly. You also want to consider maybe creating manual many-to-many relationships. Even though there are native many-to-many relationships in the application, the manual ones really give you a little bit more flexibility to be able to capture common data between the two related entities, or if you have very specific reporting needs, you can function those based upon those items. If you have specific areas where you want to work with a specific record, you might want to look at doing hierarchies. That would allow you to create a self-referencing relationship, designate that as a hierarchical relationship, and then that way you have the ability to allow users to be able to view all records within that specific hierarchy much easier than if they had to actually go in and navigate to the appropriate records as needed. The other thing is when you're working with it and when users are attaching records to a parent. So for example, if they have a case associated with a specific account, you could actually go in and use entity mapping to help facilitate that. That'll populate the specific fields that you defined from the parent, like the address or even the phone number or something like that. And then once you work through that, that'll pre-populate that so users can decide whether or not they want to use that or just overwrite that information based upon those situations. And then once you actually create your specific relationships and entities and items, and before you actually go in and start modifying the forms, it is a good idea to go ahead and create those relationships ahead of time, because that way when you start going into the customizing of and modification of forms and views like we're going to do here in the next few modules, you already have those relationships defined, and you'll make sure that the subgrids and the items that you're adding to those individual records will actually display the way that they should.